Welcome to Chapter 4 of Skeletal. I'm Vincent Keith, and I hope you enjoy the story. Smutty's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. The old pickup truck rumbled along the back road, its engine wheezing like a chain smoker on a flight of stairs. He'd told himself the drive would quell the seething anger inside him, but it only seemed to get worse. Hours had passed since he'd lied about having a shift at work, and the anxiety was growing in on his chest like a vice, squeezing tighter with each minute. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but desolate stretches of road. His house was off limits. The thought of returning to their drunken mess made his stomach churn. "Gotta go back to Ben's," he muttered to himself. As he rounded a corner, a parade of trucks idled on the roadside. Smutty's heart picked up a beat as he slowed down, squinting against the lights. Deputy Cray stood among the vehicles, shotgun in hand, jeans and a flannel shirt replacing his normal uniform. Something was obviously very wrong as Smutty pulled over and rolled down his window. "Deputy Cray?" Smutty called out tentatively. "Go home, Lawrence," Cray warned, not turning to face him. "Your dumbass shouldn't be here." "Man, I was just," Smutty started, but the sight of more men emerging from the trees, guns at the ready, stole his next words. "Go home," Cray said through his gritted teeth. "Now!" Sophie's fingers shook as they traced the ancient symbols on the worn pages before her. The Theban script unveiling secrets that twisted her gut. Words blurred as tears welled up, fear gripping her as she attempted to catch her breath. "This can't be real," she thought, shaking her head in an attempt to dispel her fear over what she was learning. Like anyone, she thought the stories of witches and spells were clichés intended to scare people. Upon reading the witch's papers, or what she now knew to be a grimoire, she had learned that the practices went far past anything she could have imagined. Each part of the body, every piece of flesh or strand of hair or tendon, tooth or nail, gut and its juices had a purpose. Some were used to bind spells together, and some were to release them. Some were to enhance and focus the intent of the witch, and some were to camouflage the work so that others would not see. Sacred above all was the blood, for which almost no spell of consequence could be completed without. It was the same with the stones and crystals that could be used in their natural forms or ground into powder. Wood and water were necessary for many spells, and every plant had a distinct quality from which a desired effect could be derived. The grimoire listed so many examples of flora and fauna, each with a purpose that Sophie could not believe existed. How to combine them when they must be harvested? There were many, many fine details about this practice, and it was overwhelming to a shocking extent. Her room felt like a prison. She shoved her notes into her backpack, resolved to go back to Bennett's. But before she could open the door, a knock sounded, and her mother's voice, soft and concerned, came from the other side. "Sophia, are you still awake? We're worried about you, honey." Sophie startled, nearly dropping her backpack. "I'm okay. I'm fine. Just reading. But I'm going to sleep soon. I'm really tired." "All right," her mother said from the other side. "Come and get us if you need anything. Love you, honey." "I love you too. Good night." Sophie gasped for air, her panic attack clawing its way up her throat. She couldn't stay here, not with the script's revelations festering in her mind. Something was happening to her, and she knew it was because of the cabin and the grimoire. She had to get out, had to go to Bennett's. The building panic too heavy a burden to bear, but she couldn't sneak out until her folks fell asleep. Bennett's silhouette remained motionless against the faint glow of streetlights seeping through the curtains. The thick darkness within the house seemed to pulse with his quickening heartbeat, each thud resonating in the quiet space like a drumbeat. Sweat dampened his brow as tremors seized his hands, an unbidden reaction to fear and confusion. He reached for his phone, but his fingers recoiled as if repelled by an unseen force. An inexplicable compulsion urged him away from contacting Sophie or Smutty, leaving him stranded in his own mind's swirling chaos. The weight of solitude pressed upon him, heavy as the oppressive air that filled the room. His mother had been asked to work a double shift, not a surprise given the news and the fact that most people wanted to stay at home. Bennett was used to being alone, but now he desperately wished he wasn't. He felt adrift in time, hours feeling like days in the murky stillness where whispers of bones and murdered echoed through his subconscious, mingling with the growing hum of panic. Meledra had found refuge from the daylight in an old equipment barn. She had stayed there all day among forgotten tools coated in rust and cobwebs. Her presence as small as she could make it. Even her breath had slowed, a silent rhythm syncing with the cadence of nature. She had found the simple ingredients she needed and used them to focus inward, weaving a veil of concealment that shrouded her essence from those who might seek her kind. As she worked, a subtle vibration tickled her senses. Remnants of psychic dissonance from the violent end that had befallen Crow, and she knew it would attract others. With every fiber of her being, she reinforced the spell, masking her energy from the growing number of prying entities. As night fell, Meledra mulled over the witch whose machinations had set these grim events into motion, a conjurer of formidable strength to stir such unrest among humans and kindred spirits alike. But now, the last quarter moon's pending ascent urged Meledra to move into place before the veil between worlds grew thin. The glare of the headlights through the curtains shattered the lethargy that had frozen Bennett. He rose, squinting against the intrusion of light, relief flooding through his veins as he expected to see Smutty. But as he stepped outside, the figure stepping out from the vehicle wasn't the wiry frame of his friend. It was Sheriff Hanlon, his hat casting shadows over stern features. Bennett's heart pounded, each beat a drum of impending trouble. As the sheriff approached with purpose in his stride, the crunch of gravel under the man's boots echoing in Bennett's ears like the grinding of bones. "Evening, Ben," Hanlon said, keeping his voice calm and even. His eyes, though, held an urgency at bay. "Mind if we talk?" Sure." Bennett's voice was a quiet echo of his confusion. He stepped down from the porch. "What's going on?" Hanlon eased his tone. "Everything is fine." He glanced over his shoulder toward the road where he had just left the vigilante group. "But the boys are wound tighter than a $2 watch, and I'm looking for something that will calm them down." "What does that have to do with me?" Bennett replied, surprising himself with the edgy tone in his voice. He noticed the lines of stress around Hanlon's eyes growing tighter, and he dreaded the sheriff's next words. Hanlon looked at him square on now, a directness that made Bennett tense. "I'd like to have a look at the drone footage you took earlier, when you flew it over the crime scene." The boy's eyes went wide, and the sheriff made a note of how strange Bennett was acting. "I need to know if you caught anything that would be considered evidence, and if an aerial view will show us anything we couldn't see from the ground." Bennett's throat tightened as images spun through his head. The inside of the abandoned house they had broken into. The witch's house, the papers, the piles of bones. He could be in serious trouble if the sheriff found out. He stammered out the only excuse he could think of. "I have to delete the video every day. Memory's not that big on a drone, but I didn't see anything." "Is that right?" Hanlon's gaze sharpened, his instincts easily spotting the lie. "You know, evidence is a funny thing, and you're not trained to recognize it. Are you sure that none of it gets saved anywhere?" Every instinct screamed at Bennett to guard his secrets. "I'm positive," he said with ice in his tone, but the lie tasted sour on his lips. Before Hanlon could press further, the distant sound of a gunshot shattered the silence of the night. The lone crack was quickly followed by a succession of others and the shouting of men. "God damn it!" Hanlon swore, spinning on his heels and running back to his truck. He slammed the door and ignited the blue lights in one fluid motion. Gravel flew as the vehicle spun, racing away with sirens wailing, leaving Bennett alone with the reverberating echoes of the unseen chaos. Bennett's pulse hammered against the silence. Everything was closing in. In the shadows, the skeletal tower of bones stood vigilant. It had moved toward the one it was spelled to protect, and it waited, guarding its master. Bennett stood frozen, rattled by the sheriff's visit as a new set of headlights angled down the street. Bennett watched as Smutty's truck skidded to a stop on the gravel drive. "Holy shit, we're screwed," Bennett said as Smutty stepped out, the engine ticking as it cooled. "Hanlon wants the footage from the drone." Smutty glanced around, noting the silhouettes of curious onlookers in the neighboring houses. Shots were still being fired in the distance, and Hanlon's siren wailed. Smutty blurted, "What the hell is going on?" "Shots started coming from over there, a lot of them. Hanlon was here, but he bolted as soon as they started," Bennett replied, wiping his sweat from his brow. The panic attack was starting to lose its grip, and Bennett pulled out his phone and texted Sophie. "Meet us ASAP," he texted, thumbs stumbling over each other. "Is that Sophie?" Smutty asked, peering over Bennett's shoulder. "Yeah," Bennett admitted, his voice strained. "Bro, you sure it's a good idea for her to come out?" A series of rapid flashes lit up the woods like a macabre strobe light. Each muzzle flash was accompanied by the crack of gunfire, puncturing the night with violence. In the forest, the vigilante group formed a jagged line, flashlights casting long, haunting shadows between the trees. Their nerves were already frayed, every snap of a twig sending jolts through their veins. Then it happened. One man, farthest from the safety of numbers, saw it, a silhouette so grotesque, so utterly impossible, that his mind fractured at the sight. It loomed from the shadows, long claws clacking against each other as a toothsome grin conveyed the promise of a horrifying death. The man's gasp sounded through the silence just before he unleashed a shot, and then more, into the darkness. Panic spread like wildfire. Shouts and curses filled the airs as more men opened fire, as imagined enemies closed in from all sides. Amidst the frenzy, a dark figure moved unseen, his presence a malignant whisper in the minds of the men. It was simple for him to make them see many more flashes, louder gunshots, and staccato rhythms, and fill the darkness with terror-filled screams, both imagined and torn from their own throats. He wove through their ranks, casting illusions tailored to their deepest fears. Creatures of nightmares flickering across the shadows at the edges of their vision, twisted beings with eyes glowing malevolently from the darkness. The man known as Tenevor reveled in the terror he sowed. These men, armed and dangerous when they were left to their own devices, were now 10 times more dangerous as puppets dangling upon the strings of primal fear. As their volleys and screams shattered the night, Tenevor withdrew, leaving behind a trail of hysteria among the men and a warning to the others of his kind that he sensed in the area. Sophie crouched next to her window as she peered into the night. The house had fallen into silence after her parents had gone to bed, leaving Sophie free to escape. Her fingers trembled as they gripped the sill, not from the chill of the evening breeze, but from the electric fear that pulsed through her veins. She had heard the shots and knew there was trouble, but after Bennett's text she couldn't stand to be alone. With a soft thud, her feet met the ground outside, and she was just about to sprint towards Bennett's place when she froze, her pulse catching in her throat. A woman stood there, cloaked in shadow, her presence both startling and strangely mesmerizing. It was as if the night had shared a secret, as Meledra stood in a shadow. Recognizably human, but there was something else. The air around them started to vibrate with energy, a resonance that whispered of a hidden connection. "Where are you going, little crow?" Meledra's voice was soft, a melody that danced upon the night air, weaving between the trees in the summer darkness. Sophie's eyes widened, her instinct to freeze wearing with her desire to flee. Meledra took a deliberate step toward her. "The threads of fate draw tightly around us." Sophie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air. It was as though Meleger's words hinted at a destiny that Sophie could not yet see, and yet, despite the ominous undertone, there was something compelling about this strange figure before her. "Who?" Sophie whispered, the scent of pine and earth enveloping her as she took a step backward. Without another word, instinct guided Sophie's feet, and she hurriedly stepped back. A few steps more, and in a fresh burst of panic, Sophie turned and began to sprint towards Bennett's house, the encounter with the woman leaving her mind and spirit drowning in a sea of terror. This concludes Chapter 4 of Skeletal. I'm Vincent Keith, and thank you for listening.